Welcome to the Art of Procurement podcast. My name is Philip Heidson, a 20-year procurement practitioner, former head of procurement and advisor to procurement leaders around the world. I started Art of Procurement to help leaders and their teams access the resources they need to increase their impact through insight-driven procurement. You are listening to our flagship podcast where we pull back the curtain and shine a light on the strategies, tactics and tools that leading procurement teams are using to align their impact with the needs of their business. And today on the show, I'm joined by Mele, the managing partner of Software Pricing Partners. I love talking to people with an outside perspective to understand the tricks of their trade, their experiences of working with procurement, and to learn how we can better collaborate for the benefit of our organizations. And my conversation with Chris today actually has two different parts to it. First, we discuss the art of pricing in the software industry. In procurement, pricing is often seen as a black box, and especially in categories like software as a service, where pricing is often value-based rather than input cost-based. So we'll talk about fairness in pricing and how to understand if your supplier or a prospective supplier is just trying to extract as much cash from you as possible, or if the offer on the table is in line with that their other clients actually get charged as well. And then secondly, we deviated into a conversation about RFPs from a sales perspective. Chris certainly has his own experiences to share, but he also solicited the views of other sales professionals. And there are two ways that you can listen to this. First, with a view that, well, a salesperson is telling me how to do my job so that it's easier for them to make more sales, or with a really critical ear that helps you design a go-to-market approach, whether that's using an RFP or otherwise, that actually delivers the results that your business needs. I thought it was a really insightful conversation, so I definitely encourage you to listen and to listen to kind of the finer details of it. So with that being said, let's go straight into the conversation. So usually we start this conversation by asking folks how they got into procurement, but we're going to come to today's topic from a slightly different angle. And I know that procurement isn't your background. So I wonder if you could just tell us, Chris, a little bit about your current role and a little insight into the journey that brought you to this point.
Well, first, thank you for having me. And for my day job, if you will, I'm the managing partner here at Software Pricing Partners. So I spend my days dealing with the executives of SaaS companies, high growth, publicly traded and privately held, trying to help them more effectively monetize their intellectual property. And that, if you just this morning in the kitchen with my kids and their teacher, I was chatting with her about their school today, and I was laughing because I always said, hey, pay attention in math. And then my reaction in school was, well, when am I ever going to use that again? And so, here I sit in the center of pricing, and math is a really big part of one of the big giant pieces of pricing, right? It's the price point.
Yeah.
There's other things that go into it. And so that's a lot of strategy, a lot of ethical competitive intelligence, a lot of sort of painting the mosaic together. And my journey here was that I started my career like you did. We chatted beforehand that you were at one of the former Big Six. Back then it was Andersen. When I did it, I was at Ernst & Young. Started a software company, migrated over into SaaS from on-premise software. So before we had the cloud and all of that great stuff. And I didn't know how to put that revenue model together and how we were going to make money. So I ultimately hired Software Pricing Partners. They were the only game in town that had done B2B software. Everybody else was pricing sort of things you could touch, planes, trains, and automobiles. And it doesn't quite work that way with intellectual property. And then after hiring them and exiting that in 2013, I had a chance to join the team over here. And a lot of what we did was around turning monetization into a process rather than this thing called an event where you just build a great product and then figure out its price later. I mean, there's all kinds of decisions you can make along the way in the design stage of your product that makes a big deal out of that, or a big difference in the outcome of that. And I just became a really big believer after getting indoctrinated into this whole new discipline. It's just a whole new field of expertise. And if you'd asked me early on, is there such a thing as a software pricing company? I would have said, I've never heard, no idea what you're talking about. And it turns out there's not a lot of them. And we've been around since '82. It's the firm that started it all. And I wanted to come to the source with all that history and knowledge to be able to learn it from the experts.
Yeah, it's funny, as a procurement professional, you sometimes think that The software is priced at a point where, what can we get away with? Like you say, you built the product. Now let's think about pricing and what the market will bear, as opposed to perhaps that going in, but you're building a product to fit that market segment, if you will, and the pricing around that market segment from the get-go. It sounds like that's kind of the approach that you recommend that companies take to pricing anyway.
Yes, but you do know that it's not always been that way. I mean, what's interesting in the software business is we are all, and this is really kind of still true. It's changing, but it's not changing overnight. But we're all indoctrinated in what we would refer to as a product market fit
Mm-hmm.
orientation. And if you look at building a product, first we would build it and hope they appear. And then later we're saying, well, let's not do that. Let's really get into the customer's mind and do minimum MVPs and get into agile and iterative development. But it's all around building a great product and making the customer happy, and a great UX, user design, and a user experience, and streamlining workflows, et cetera. And it wasn't really until relatively recently that people began to realize there's a real science behind pricing. And it's not just pricing, it's how do you license and package, and then ultimately how do you charge for your software. And so what you really want to be able to do is design the product around its monetization strategy before we put Pete's under the door and get the code back, right? And so that carries with it a very different orientation, and we would call that a product market profitability fit
Mm-hmm.
orientation. And that is still relatively new phenomenon, and I think that's part of today's conversation around the RFP. It emerged at a time probably when people were kind of making up the price and seeing what they could get. And it doesn't take a lot of rocket science to get on the phone and call around and realize that Charles and David, who bought the same thing, paid two different
Right.
prices, and bingo, now we have a feeling as if we're buying a used car.
Yep. Is it fair to say that pricing is more related to the customer segment, the value that's being created, as opposed to the input costs that go into creating that software?
It is. So there are the costs to both build and deliver, especially in the cloud
Yeah.
inside their infrastructure. And there are economies of scale there. Everybody knows that. However, the value that you're creating is what the software company wants to be paid fairly for.
Mm-hmm.
And if they are paid fairly, then they get to return that back into the investment into the product, right? And so if we
Yeah.
have a orientation where everybody's trying to get the least possible price and we're compressing all that down, hey, don't be surprised if the roadmap of what you're going to get next year is half of what it should be, right? I mean, there is a reality to the economics of the business model. However, when you're charging for the value, the the every pricing strategy has a philosophical underpinning that often is never talked about, and there isn't an adherence to a philosophy. And so we would tell you that that philosophy should be built on something called market fairness. And I think there's a
Mm-hmm.
really big misunderstanding in the world of pricing. And so when we talk about customer segments, we inherently begin to think about, well, if I'm selling in manufacturing and then I'm selling in oil and gas, manufacturing, they have really tight margins in oil
Yeah.
and gas. They seem to be killing it. When we violate market fairness, we take that same product at a list price of $1,000, and $1,000 for manufacturing becomes $10,000 for oil and gas. And then
Mm-hmm.
no one ever really thinks about the CEO of the oil and gas company and the CEO of the manufacturing company going to the same golf club and playing golf this weekend, which they do right here, in my hometown. I mean,
Yep.
that happens, right? And then people compare notes. And so this idea of market segmentation is horribly misunderstood in pricing, because it's almost as if they're trying to charge not what the market will bear in aggregate, adhering to fairness, but rather what each customer would pay maximum, regardless of if they bought the same thing. And that's the problem. That's the core misunderstanding that exacerbates RFPs, and this feeling that
Mm-hmm.
everybody has that when I buy software, I'm going to be taken advantage of. I don't want to be the guy that buys $1 million in software only to find out that somebody else paid 250,000 for the same thing I bought. And so
Yeah.
now we gear all these processes and procurements and pressure, and this whole game has emerged because this philosophical underpinning of treating customers fairly is just non-existent. And I think that that is not by design. I think that is symptomatic of how pricing has emerged more slowly as a discipline over the decades.
You can understand it. Obviously an organization looking at how they can maximize their revenues based on the product that they're selling. But I think that drives a lot of mistrust, when it comes to the procurement community, because as you said, the CEOs kind of go to the golf course and talk about it. Well, so do the procurement professionals. And that's where
That's
they
right.
start to understand, well, I'm paying 3 times more, or I've heard of 10 times more, whatever the number is. I'm being taken advantage of. And then that just immediately erodes all trust, and it not just in that provider, but in the industry itself, which I'm sure, leads to, and we talked about the RFP process, and we want to talk about the RFP process today, using tools like that as a way to put pressure on price only and look at price only, because the trust doesn't exist that you're not being taken advantage of.
Well, and to put a fine point on that, the trust would be there if there was a structure and design up front that enabled consistency as
Mhm.
that strategy flowed down to, let's say, 100 reps spread across 7 different countries on the globe selling the software. But if that structure and discipline wasn't there, if the pricing sort of evolved more organically and people were kind of copying competitors and kind of maybe the founders were making it up. When I had my software company, I can tell you when it came to our pricing, I literally made it up,
Yep.
and that's what you did, and that's kind of how it rolled. And then, son of a gun, you sold it and you tried it a little bit larger next time, a little bit larger, a little bit, and then you get big enough and people start comparing notes, right?
Mhm.
And it was funny because in my journey, we had ERP like software in the remodeling and construction industry. And we had, I don't know, 40 different accounting systems we talked to, half a dozen different design systems. And then inside of the ERP, you had all these different configurations of the modules that you could pick. And then on top of that, you would carry all kinds of catalogs of interior and exterior products. And I would tell everybody, look, and I was very kind of egoic about it. I think I was like, look, what are the odds that two people are going to compare the price? I mean, we can kind of do whatever we want here,
Right.
right? And then we had this event, and it was called the Fast Track Dealer Summit, and it was here at the Richard Petty's Driving Experience, and they took 30 customers, all handpicked, and her name was Julie, and and his name was John, and they were in different states. And son of
Mhm.
a gun, if they didn't use the exact same design system, the exact same module configuration, the exact same interface with QuickBooks, and they carried all the same catalogs, and one compared price to the other. And I was getting out of the car doing the drive around, and I caught Julie's face sitting next, I didn't design it that way. They just happened to sit serendipitously at the same table. And I caught her expression and I knew, and we never got that customer relationship back. I mean, it was
Mhm.
just it was such an eye opener for me to destroy trust like that in such a moment. I just thought, oh my gosh, we got to do something different.
Yeah, how do you get out? How do you get out of that one? And I guess the answer
You
is you
don't.
don't.
You
Yeah.
don't. You take your learnings, and we had a defection, and it was terrible. It was terrible. I mean, that was a wonderful customer relationship that we destroyed.
Now, you obviously see a lot of buyers buying software. Is there a typical buying journey that you see? I think before a potential customer, a prospect, is in conversations, and then after they talk to procurement, and does kind of that intention or journey change when procurement gets involved?
Well, I think that the stories that get repeated the most tend to be with the larger organizations whose whether procurement was designed this way or organically evolved this way is relatively and highly disconnected from the business. So
Hmm.
it's a bit of a department of redundancy department in the sense that the salesperson kind of has to start over. There's no real communication. It's almost like a gate gets closed,
Yeah.
and now you're sort of stuck with a new owner here, and that owner doesn't really have the interest level to understand value. They're going to be driving for a certain price point that they're
Hmm.
going for, and in comes the pressure, and in comes the frustration. They don't understand what the budget is. They don't understand the driving factors of how decisions are made, and there's a real lack of information for then the sales team to even have any sort of guiding nuggets by which to respond. And this exacerbates very long struggles and discussions
Yeah.
and frustration, to where if you then took that sales team and went behind the door and talked to the founder, you're getting conversations like, let's just withdraw. This isn't worth the time.
Hmm.
This is a huge distraction. And the unfortunate part about that experience is those that make it through and become a customer, I think the relationship is sort of permanently altered.
Yeah.
And this wonderful
Yeah.
relationship you had with the business side, where everybody wanted to go out of their way and help everybody, now becomes a little bit more toxic. And this affects the success, right? This affects, if boundaries are given around a deal that are so tight and so constrained, and now we run into a hiccup on the project, it is going to be a change request. We're not going to go figure out this little data conversion mess and solve it. It's a different relationship that turns less into driving superior results and everybody
Hmm.
sort of getting behind the flag of wanting to do the right thing, to this company's really positioning for advantage, and now they have to have their guard up, and every time they call in, you have to be careful they're not consuming too much time. It inexorably changes the nature of the relationship. And I think that I remember an advisor told me once, you can tell a lot about a company by how they treat their legal. So something as simple as somebody sends you a one-sided NDA. In today's world, if it's not a mutual NDA, watch out, right? Like,
Yeah.
there's signals that are sent all along the way. And I worry sometimes that inside that RFP process and that procurement process, the signals that get sent to the software company create a relationship that both parties would be disappointed if they were able to describe in words what each side was feeling.
Yeah, the signals, I think you're spot on, because you look at the continuum of what a supplier relationship can be, from the collaborative on one end to completely transactional on the other. And one of my pet peeves in procurement is calling partners vendors. And I'm sure folks on the show and
Oh
who have
yeah,
watched events and things like that are sick of me talking about this.
no,
But
that's one of those words that you're just,
it triggers me.
well,
It,
it triggers all salespeople too. I mean, any salesperson that senses they're being treated as a vendor, especially in large enterprise or more complicated installations or implementations, you're watch out.
Yeah, because
That's
it signals that you're nothing more than like the hot dog vendor on the street, where you'll go to another one on the next corner if you don't get what you want. To me,
that's right.
and so when you're doing that, you're going to go into that mindset as well, like you just talked about. And it's funny, when you're in, um, often when you're a procurement professional, certainly in larger organizations, because I've been there. You think, well, I've got a big wallet, and so that's all that matters. And if a provider is committing to do something, then I've got the power of my wallet again to make sure they do it. What a lot of folks don't realize is what you were talking about before. You're always looking at, how can I reduce my cost to serve. If I have the opportunity to go above and beyond, where am I going to do that with? I'm going to do that and put the best resources on the accounts where I think there's more benefit for me of doing so. And so while all these things may never be openly admitted in court, that is essentially how you look at delivery, based on how you've got to where you are, and the signals and the messages that your buyer has been sending you.
It's interesting to hear you talk about transaction versus collaborative, and it makes me think about again, what is the nature of intellectual property versus what is the nature when I buy a static thing like a
Mhm.
vehicle or a capital piece of equipment? And the fundamental difference with intellectual property, especially with software, is it's always changing.
Yeah.
And so if you treat it as a transaction, the thing that I think is often missed is behind the scenes at the software company, you know, there's a thing called the roadmap, and there is a plan of future capabilities that that software product is going to do because you are investing in a product and its future and it's not necessarily today's value, it's tomorrow's value as well. And so when you treat it as a transaction, something as simple as the software company that has competing needs across many different customers that drives that roadmap, if you happen to be the more collaborative,
Mhm.
you're going to have one heck of an input into that roadmap and the prioritization. And there might be a set of features and capabilities that get prioritized pretty heavily because the relationship is honorable and it's healthy and it's collaborative and everybody loves everybody, right? Kumbaya, we all sit around the
Yep.
campfire. It's never like that, but you get the idea. If what comes out though is more of a transactional vendor, highly or maybe any sort of toxic like output that triggers this response, then all of a sudden the product, the transaction is the transaction, and the roadmap
Mhm.
starts to veer over to the other more collaborative players, and that's really unfortunate because in the act of how the participants inside of the ones issuing the RFP are responding and acting really sets the stage for the access to future development and capabilities that could be
Right.
serious competitive advantages for them. And that's the whole idea of the RFP,
Mhm.
is to take down a competitive advantage. But yet, if we come out of it in a transaction toxic way, we don't get what we want. And it's sort of like this self-fulfilling prophecy. So there are real ramifications that, like you said, aren't going to come out in the court of law. I mean, it's like my grandfather used to say, you can have every contract you want, but at the end of the day, people still buy from people, right? So
Right.
that sometimes is missed.
It's funny you say that. I always tell folks that a contract, if you ever have to look at the contract past the day that you signed it, there's a problem
That's right.
because it should be done and dusted and never looked at ever again. Um, I want to talk about the RFP process. So, what are some of the software industry's concerns then with the RFP process?
Well, so I did a lot of homework before this, and so I think they largely center around a handful of themes.
Hmm.
And I'll start with one. And by the way, just for my background, I mean I've sold software in the millions of dollars all the way down to $19 a month
Yeah.
when we started with our cloud edition in the CRM world, and no stranger to being on the receiving end of RFPs, and also you probably in full transparency should know that any of our customers in the software community that want to procure pricing services, if they were to issue a formal RFP, we withdraw. We
Hmm.
don't even participate in those. And so that's kind of gives you right there a bit of a sense of my personal experience, right? With
Yes.
with the process. Now, every person's RFP process, every company's RFP process is different, and maybe I had a little bit more toxic ones. But I think that as a salesperson, you know, from my personal perspective and from the perspective of many of our customers, the process is so opaque and so hidden behind
Hmm.
this curtain, and it's expected that things would be confidential, and I think most sellers understand that. But the participants, the selling participants, the vendors who are all vying to be partners, we want to know how many others are participating. How will these decisions be made? When and how will the end users, the business side, be involved? Is there a connection back or not? We're trying to understand, is it worth it, right?
Yeah.
What buying priorities are the most critical? What's going to drive the decision? And none of these are typically shared in any sort of detail. And I've even had people on the phone be so brazen as to say, "Why can't I can't tell you who else is involved?" And I'm
Hmm.
thinking, well, if we're all familiar with the alternatives in the market space. If you're selling, you're in competitive situations all the time. But as a seller who values the buyer's time and has a philosophy, at least me personally, of helping them buy, and it's okay to say no. I'm not high pressuring anyone. If you educate me on the choices that are in the choice set, I can help highlight the differentiated value that you're going to want to focus on. But if you don't share any of that with me, I'm a bit in the blind. And so I think this opaqueness is really unfortunate. And I I actually have a suspicion that it's driven more from a power dynamic than from an RFP requirement, confidentiality requirement perspective.
Yeah, in my experience, I would say that, an RFP can be a really powerful tool, and it can drive really positive outcomes, and outcomes where the procurement person is a real advocate of you based on the relationship that they had through the RFP process. But they have to set up the RFP in a way that actually enables that. And that's where I think a lot of the challenges are, is that a lot of the RFPs that you'll come across, and that it sounds like you have come across, are very much I'm in control and I can't tell you anything. And that is, in my experience, at least from doing this myself earlier in my career, is two reasons. One is definitely the power dynamic of, you know um, procurement is going to be the one that is in control of leading the decision making process, and kind of using we need to make sure that everything is an apples to apples comparison, and we don't want you talking to our stakeholders and there being unfair advantages and all those things. But when you're doing that, it's like you're buying off a drawing, and you're buying something that, assuming that something from company A is exactly the same as company B, and price is the only thing that matters. Which, in 95% of RFPs, it isn't. In fact, most RFPs, it's not the single biggest decision making factor, but we treat it like it is. So I think there's the power dynamics is one of them, and the other is, and again, this is from my own experience of running my own RFPs. Before anyone else jumps on me, is the lack of market knowledge. So a lot of us in procurement are not subject matter experts in what we buy. Now, we may have a little understanding of the category. I think in software, to be honest, there are more experts in the IT space managing IT RFPs than there are in some of the other more general services spaces in procurement. But using an RFP kind of protects us against that lack of market knowledge, because we can use the RFP process to get the insights that we need to then use as leverage to negotiate later on in that process. And if we don't necessarily know what we're buying, then there's that vulnerability. An RFP helps in some cases to cover that vulnerability. If I think about, again, my own personal experiences.
Interesting. The second issue, and I've got probably maybe 4, I think, in total here, Phil. I think there's a general disrespect of the seller's time.
Mm-hmm.
RFPs typically come in high speed, tight time frames, unrealistic deadlines sometimes.
Yeah.
And there's a bit of a mustering of the troops. RFPs sometimes aren't a one person response job. I mean, it's a
Yeah.
big lift for the software company to read through the material and come up with an approach. And then, like, once the deadlines are met, the RFP issuer doesn't seem to have to honor the committed response times. All of a sudden, things just kind of go dark.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of sellers report deadlines that maybe were supposed to be next week that get extended into weeks or months, despite commitments to the contrary. And this idea of gathering the information, and I think going back to this opaque hidden curtain, the process after the responses go in and how the decisions are made and the steps afterwards are not just opaque, but they just seem, again, to be a little bit more of the power dynamic. I'm in
Yeah.
control. I need this stuff next week. And then, if I need to sit on it for 2 months, that's my prerogative. And that, I think, is the beginning trigger for some of the toxicity of the salesperson who
Mm-hmm.
busted their butt,
Yeah.
worked over the weekend, and they're waiting for a response. And then you forget that that person has to go into the sales meeting, and then they got to talk to their sales manager, and the sales manager goes to go back and talk to the VP, and the VP has to go talk to the chief revenue officer. And, there's only so many selling hours in the day, and that organization, the software company, is deploying those selling hours in the smartest way that they can think of. And these questions start to come up that isn't just the question on this RFP, but tucked behind the leadership thought process is, should we even be involved in
Right.
RFPs? Like, is this even part of our sales motion anymore? And that
Hmm.
toxicity is unfortunate, yet so powerful when these things go dark.
Yeah, it goes into a black box, doesn't it?
Yep.
And then you have to justify why you even got internally, why you ever did this and used all these resources in the first place.
Every week that goes by, the
Yeah.
conversation starts to, and then if you don't have any information, what do you start doing? You start crafting your own story. Well, they
Mhm.
were just trying to get our approach. Well, they were, we were up against another competitor, but they wouldn't share who it was. They're probably going to end up buying this or building it on their own anyway.
Yeah, and I when I think about that again from my personal experience, it's probably because we we need to be in control of the timing, the process, and so and there isn't necessarily a lot of thought that goes into everything that needs to go in from a supplier side to put a presentation and to respond to an RFP. So, it's like let's get as quickly as possible all the offers on the table, and then we can kind of come to that in our own time based on what our internal stakeholders needing. Now, oftentimes timeframes are pushed back because of budgets. A stakeholder will say, "Sure, I've got the budget," and it turns out, well, maybe they didn't quite have the budget. So you have to go through a whole approval process for that. But it's definitely, I certainly recognize that challenge with an RFP.
All right, you ready for the next one?
Go for it.
uh, Once you're in the RFP process, and let's say you didn't win from the black box,
Hmm.
there's just no feedback.
Yeah.
So, why were you not selected? What kind of gaps were perceived? How might, my team, my sales team do better in the future? It's such a black hole. There's no feedback loop.
Yeah.
It's basically all or nothing. And this concept of all or nothing is really important because if you go through the RFP process and you get no information, you end up with nothing. You literally just lost everything. There's no value upside unless you win. It's all
Hmm.
or nothing. So you get this
Yeah.
giant loss of your selling hours. And of course, guess what happens to the participants that lose? Now we had a black box, a few hundred hours that got tanked. We have no idea why. And then that gets reported back through the
Yeah.
chain all the way up. And that's a real missed opportunity because I think, in the world of win-loss research, which is part of our customer research function, that's really valuable stuff. I don't think any salesperson would tell you, I don't mind if we lose, but man, it's a real treat when you know why.
Hmm.
What did you not see? What part of the value prop did you not get? Was it, what aspect of this services product or your experience in the sales process didn't resonate? Or, is our messaging kind of off a little bit? Because it does tend to drift. If a
Yeah.
software product's always changing, your messaging sometimes does get off. But in the RFP, you get nothing. I remember a personal story, just as a quick side note. We spent hundreds of hours in RFP. This was years and years and years ago at my previous software company. And I said, you know what? We're going to blow this out. We're just going to do this and we're going to win it. And we just went all in, did the whole thing. And of course, we had modules and all these other things. And we had a beautiful approach. And we said, look, this is a range. And the range, I think back then was like 200 to 600 grand. We can play in this range and we can put
Hmm.
up a certain number of stores or all the stores. And the RFP issuer, and there was a system we had to use and all this stuff, said, well, you got to put a dollar amount in there. It won't accept a range. And we're like, well, we'll put it in the PDF and then we'll put the dollar amount. And they said and guided us, just put the larger dollar amount. And I said, okay, great. Then it goes in a black box and forever later, we don't get selected, which of course you can kind of guess because that much time. And we asked why. And they said, well, in the preliminary discussion, we disqualified you because of price. because we had to disqualify you on something. And I said, well, but we had a range. And they're
Hmm.
like, well, but we only had the 600 grand number in the system. And that's why you, and I just thought, what a joke, right?
Yeah.
This is terrible. Totally terrible.
Um, yeah, that feedback's invaluable, isn't it? And like for any procurement folks listening, that feedback is while it's a distant um, benefit of going through an RFP process and losing. It is still really invaluable because it can inform your product strategy, it can inform pricing strategy, it can inform positioning, um, and it doesn't really take much to give it after you have gone through after a potential provider has gone through the investment of time that they have to get that far in an RFP process. So I always really encourage procurement folks listening to do that. And I will say, a personal anecdote is, I look at all the relationships that I built with sales folks as I was a practitioner in procurement, and probably the greatest relationship that I built with somebody on the other side of the table was for an organization who didn't win the business. But we led a transparent process and we fed back, and that led to building a relationship. And as people move on, those relationships stay, and it came to benefit me, later on in my career in another organization and himself. So there's benefits you might not see today, but if you can advocate for at least sharing as much information as you possibly can, it will come back and benefit you later.
I think that's a really important point and a so often missed opportunity, because the RFP requires an audience of participants that aren't kind of over time saying, I'm not doing this anymore. And so that feedback loop is a wonderful, I guess the way I would think about it is, the RFP issuer is beholden and relying on the free participation of the sellers. And so, in a sense, it is a service,
Yeah.
right? And the more that you think about it as a service, the more that I think you'll start to realize there's opportunities to keep the participants happy, even if they don't win, and keep them
Hmm.
informed throughout that. And if it's treated more as a product or service offering to the community, I think that would actually change a lot of viewpoints right there. That might really position things very differently in the mind of the RFP creators.
There's some consumer product companies that I've worked with in the past where they look at everybody who participates in an RFP and really anyone who interacts with procurement or their organization as a potential customer, because at
That's
the end
right.
of the day, everyone's a consumer. And so taking that perspective really changes how they communicate and interact. And looking at those folks as not, well, it's a dispensable, the time doesn't really matter. We just want some data so we can use it to do an apples to apples comparison across a few different suppliers. But if we treat them badly, then that's going to hurt our sales. And we don't want to do that. On the flip side, if we treat them well, that could actually help us from a revenue perspective.
Well said.
So, number 4, I think you had a fourth one to hit me with.
Yeah, I might have even more. We could do a part 2 if you want. So this one I think is just more of a mechanical item, and I hear this one a lot too. But sometimes the way the RFP is constructed, they have sort of these questions that create gradients that are hard to interpret. So, for
Hmm.
example, one in particular, our enterprise chief revenue officer shared with me from their enterprise team is the it was framed as do you have this capability? And the answers were yes, or in development, or not in development but on the roadmap, or not on the roadmap at all. And the problem with this is it lets participants live in the gray areas, and it really does encourage overstating and exaggerating. For example, if I
Hmm.
don't have the capability, um, it's not that salespeople flat out lie, but they can certainly stretch the truth. And if called on the carpet with it, there's all sorts of rationale. Well, it was on the roadmap, but then it was taken off the roadmap. And I think that if you're early on in your RFP participation as a seller, you maybe start a little bit more idealistic and you answer those questions very honestly and
Hmm.
accurately. And then you learn really quickly that when you do that, you're at a horrible disadvantage for
Right.
the quote unquote pros who are just like check, 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 check.
Yep.
And they're just getting through that process, knowing full well once you get into implementation and the gap appears, too late. Right.
Yeah.
And so this really erodes, I think, the integrity of the process, and it just allows too many people to live in that gray. And then if you combine that back with what you mentioned earlier, where the person in procurement doesn't have what I would call, fluency or comfortableness or expertise in the area of the software, well, now we have quite the rodeo.
So I sense, I know we teed up 4 there. I sense that based on your experience, that there may be a few more examples. And I'm actually asking and continuing to go down this line of questioning because I think it's super insightful for procurement folks that are listening. Not to see this as, well, this is, somebody on the sales side saying that they hate RFPs because they didn't win the business, but more getting the perspective and the insights of somebody who is receiving the RFPs that you're sending and how that influences how they may be responding to it. Because ultimately, that as a procurement person is going to impact the results that you get from an RFP process and how it ties and aligns with what a stakeholder actually needs. So, are there any more on your hit list that
There are, and I think from the perspective, what I'm sharing here is a shared perspective. It's obviously some derived from my personal experience, but dealing with the executive teams over these sales organizations for software companies, these are common
yeah.
things that come up. And in the prep for this podcast, I reached out to about a dozen of those leaders, and these are very large companies and also very high growth SaaS companies. And these are the things that came up. And this next one is one that I think is very, very problematic. And that is that the RFP is pretty susceptible to manipulation. And
Hmm.
many listeners, I'm sure, have heard of this thing called the column A vendor. And in sales, you want to be the first person in because we know that the procurement professional who's crafting the RFP, usually in combination with the business, may not be familiar with the category. So if
Hmm.
it's a new category, we can frame the decision making criteria to align with those capabilities that we provide. And column A
Interesting.
refers to the spreadsheet where typically you would have on the columns,
Yeah.
you would have all your capabilities down the rows, and of course the first column is usually kind of psychologically your favorite, and then you add in columns B and C for vendors 2 and 3. But column A, vendor helped you frame the criteria that, hey, it needs to
Hmm.
have an API layer and it needs to have a HIPAA compliancy, and by the way, it needs to have a workflow engine that does this thing and that thing and an AI engine or whatever it is. The problem is that for the other participants, when they receive the RFP, remember they're experts in their field, and they see uh, this in our world it's called a willingness to pay survey, which there's no academic basis that you can ask anybody what they're willing to pay for software and get any sort of accurate response, because as soon as you do that, people assume higher price, higher pay, or higher
Yeah.
quality, and lower price, lower quality. It's just a
Yeah.
completely bogus. But yet, I can't tell you over the years how many RFPs I've seen that say, how do you conduct your willingness to pay survey? Well, right away, as a selling team, our sales team knows they must have been talking to a competitor that offers that service. And so we know that we're not column A, and that's an easy withdraw, right? And so
Hmm.
if you think about the savvier sales teams, when they read those RFPs, they're looking to see who got in first, and they can tell based on those requirements. And so the questions are already stacked against them. It's already rigged. And so the savvier ones will withdraw. And if you reflect on this phenomenon and really think about what happens, you'll realize that that RFP process, as a symptom of its current design, actually maximizes the buyer's risk at a time when they're really trying to pursue all options available. They have inadvertently explored very little of the domain because of this column A phenomenon. And that's really at odds with the RFP purpose, which is to invite everybody in, to open up the playing field, to
Right.
see on the fringe and because you're seeking a competitive advantage if you're taking in technology usually. And so you want success, and success is other options. But that actually reduces options, right?
Now, as a sales person, are you trained? And I use the word trained loosely more. Is it something that you're really looking out for? Whether it's obvious that you're there just to make up the numbers,
Oh, for
versus it
sure. It's
being a
and I don't think
competitive
you're trained.
opportunity.
This is called the school of hard knocks.
Right.
You only have to participate on a few of those before you realize real quick if you're that one.
Mhm. Um,
And that therefore, remember also, if RFPs take a lot of time and you happen to be in a space where there's a lot of those, you can't respond to them all anyhow. I mean, consulting organizations maybe can, because you have consultants that are sitting on the bench, but in
right.
a software company, you're not really sitting people on the bench. Everybody's very busy doing their job, and so you might have to choose which ones to invest your time into, and that's going to be an easy disqualify.
Yeah. Because I know that, I mean, for better or worse, it happens a lot. You'll have a stakeholder who comes to you and they want to go with one particular provider. You have to go and I use air quotes to say test the market. But it's nothing more than getting competitive intelligence to try and use against the folks that are already the shoe in.
That's
Um,
right.
or you don't get an opportunity to talk scope. It's very, this is what you will buy. This is what we will buy, and we don't really care if you have other ways to solve the problem. Um,
Now going back to taking this a little bit further for our next topic, which is, I would tell you, stepping back and looking at this, RFPs really do discourage innovation. And
mhm.
what will happen over time now, using this example I was talking about in our space, a willingness to pay study? Well, I could easily then say, well, gee whiz, all these RFPs are coming in and they're asking about this willingness to pay study. And now I got to get on the phone and educate people that even in all the top schools, Harvard, MIT, whatever, I mean, nobody does any of this willingness to pay stuff because it doesn't work. And so that's a really hard battle. Why don't I just come up with a service offering that does a willingness to pay study? Then I can just sneak on through with everybody else and I don't have to worry about it. Well, now over the years, if you reflect on that process, I'm sort of converging to the mean rather than differentiating with a service that provides high value, and in our rollout process really does explore willingness to pay in a very unique way. I may not want to continue to do that because it just isn't getting me where I need to, for
Mhm.
example, through RFPs and for the revenue generation. Now, thankfully, we don't have that issue and we've got the proper leadership to keep pushing in that direction and differentiate. But you can see the problem, right? And I can't tell you how many times I can hear our software executives say, well, if that is coming up a lot, then just put that feature in the software. Well, now all of a sudden, we've got this software bloat that does a million things, 25% of which is just because we can check the box. And I mean, it's just such a silly game, right?
So I know that we could probably talk about some others that you have on the list, and maybe we need to do this again and get together and
Happy to.
continue to kind of peel back the onion on what it's like to respond to an RFP. But I do want to. We've only got a few minutes left, and I do want to end a little bit on like what can we do about it. I mean, we've gone through, and I think for certain, a lot of the things that you talked about, procurement. Professionals listening today can really take a lot of insights into how they can make their RFP process, assuming that they're using an RFP process, one that's actually going to derive or have a greater likelihood of deriving the results that they want to drive. Now, let's go outside the RFP process. And I know I'm asking um, this from asking a salesperson how they prefer to sell to a company. Um, but how, I mean, what's going to help this relationship, or what's going to maximize the outcomes in a way that still protects the procurement teams from that trust issue that we talked about all the way at the beginning of how do I know that supplier that I'm not getting charged 10x what another supplier is just because that's what the perception is that I will bear.
Well, I think the biggest fundamental switch is the philosophical component. So just like in
Mhm.
pricing, I would tell you, if you subscribe to market fairness, treating customers equally, that bears with it a way of solving your licensing, packaging, and pricing challenges differently. Versus if I buy into the fact that I need to optimize by customer segment, and I'm okay with two customers paying differently for the same product, I might implement technology to automate that
Yeah.
disastrous process, right? And so I think philosophically, if you buy into or can adopt that the participants are really our customers, that's
Hmm.
the fertile ground, that's the foundation of all of this. Once that happens, now you begin building the appropriate future. So I think that if you can't cross that bridge, it's probably not worth talking about all the other things.
Right.
Now, when we get to this idea of some of the issues that we talked about here, well, if I'm a customer and participating, now all of a sudden I can get a better communication. I can maybe have a better connection with the things that are driving the decision. And when we talk about mechanical items about manipulating the RFP, rather than being so concrete, maybe there are discovery components in the RFP process. Maybe before there is such a thing as an RFI, maybe we do need to do a little bit more of the homework to understand the category and the
Yeah.
differentiated value and the different approaches. And then we begin to invite participants in a broader way so that we can see the different approaches rather than maybe being so concrete up front and so tactical up front that we only end up with a few RFPs and a very limited range of approaches that we can look at. Um, in the in the solutioning of anything, having built product, I think that the before you do any of that, making a list of the issues and the problems and getting people to gel around the problem that you're trying to solve is really that first step. And if you can get that list to be very concrete, then well, now we've got all kinds of solutions that can come to bear. But I think if I had to say one thing, it's that philosophical piece that is missing from so many buying processes.
Hmm.
Now that being said, there is a question that's often missed in the RFP, and that is, explain to me the rationale, the logic of how you came up with your price.
Right.
And that's not me taking your price. And we all know this game, right? The buyer says, well, give me everything. And then you give them everything. Well, take this out and take that out and put this back in. And of course, they're trying to see if it adds back up. And of course, sometimes it doesn't. And then
Yeah.
we have that rodeo. But this is, tell me your philosophy. Do you subscribe to market fairness or not? And also tell me the rationale. Tell me how you built your pricing, how
Mhm.
it came to be. Because if you are buying from somebody who's gone through that process and has a methodology and a framework and a structure, well, then that's like so much easier to dialogue. If I take this out and put it back in, I know that it always heads up to the same price. So I don't need to do that. I can just take that whole stream of my RFP part out of the process and things can be very efficient. But if I'm coming from an environment where it's all homegrown and it doesn't quite make a lot of sense or it's really convoluted to describe, then I'm up against a different problem.
Hmm. Now that's really interesting because my last question was actually going to be on that, and you may have answered it because I really like the idea of asking how you derived your pricing from a strategy perspective. Because my question was going to be for a procurement professional, then how can we be confident that the software provider is actually abiding by market fairness, and that they're not trying to 10x me because I think I'm a bigger company with a bigger wallet. Are there flags to look out for in the way they respond to the RFP? Is there things to look for on the website? Like, what should we be looking for to give confidence that I know that while there may be some debate around the margins, I'm not getting taken advantage of versus other people who are buying this product?
Well, it reminds me of a great customer story of ours. So this was about 3.5 months after we built their new pricing, and this was in the regulated and retail utility space, which is heavily, heavily RFP driven.
Hmm.
And there was uh, a company, a buyer, a procurement team, and it was in the Midwest, and they brought in the RFP participants. So clearly, this was well before COVID. And everybody sat down and they did their normal song and dance around their process of displaying. And of course, now the participants can see the participants. And I think there were like 5 or 6 of them that had been selected highly, highly competitive environment. And at about lunchtime, the procurement team, the buying team said, listen, we have a surprise session. We're going to do a working lunch. We're going to spend 30 minutes, and each of you are just going to walk us through the logic and the rationale to your pricing.
Mm-hmm.
How was it, constructed, and, sort of what was the underpinning? Like, just walk us through that. And our customer walked with a $3.5 million deal. They were the only ones that could do that.
Yeah.
And I think that's the key, right?
Yeah.
Because that pricing is becoming a fast discipline, monetization more broadly, a fast discipline at software companies. And the more that they can describe the logic and that rationale, the more that you'll have that trust in the underpinning. Because we've all heard the story of the Oracle days where somebody comes in and they see you drive up in a nice car, and all of a sudden $1 million of software. I mean, heck, we'll just go above list. It's not $1 million, it's $2 million. And for the guy that drives in a Ford and a poor pair of shoes, he gets a $250,000 deal. And so those days are gone. I think there are probably still selling teams out there that think that those days are not gone, but my understanding is procurement teams are very sophisticated and capable, and I think that the underpinning of the structure of the pricing is arguably the most important nugget you need to be extracting. And of course, that comes in three forms, right? It probably comes in today's use case. What does it look like if I solve my problem that I want to solve? And then it comes in the form of, well, what does it look like for my pilot, right? Because I don't know you and I need to do something to mitigate maybe risk if I feel like I need to do that. And then, like, what does this thing look like in year 3 when I roll this out, across the rest of the country or across the rest of the divisions? And that should all tie together.
Yeah. Well, really interesting advice. I know that there's a lot of our community are also on the software provider side as well. So I'm sure there's lots of tips that they've taken away from our conversation, as well as the folks who are on the buying side. The last question, which I always say in my podcast, is the easy one, is if listeners have really enjoyed the conversation, they want to learn a little bit more about what you do, or they want to go and find you, where would be the best place for them to do that?
Softwarepricing.com.
Okay. Then I will put a link to softwarepricing.com in our show notes. I'll also just add in your LinkedIn profile as well for folks to check you out personally. And those are all just going to be, if you go to artofprocurement.com/podcast, you're going to see all of our interviews right there, including this one with Chris. Chris, final wrap up. I just want to thank you so much for your insights today. Lots of a fascinating conversation, I think, and I think a lot more to explore in the future. So I really appreciate your time.
Thank you for having me.
I want to thank you for listening into today's episode of The Art of Procurement. To go deeper, including access to transcripts and actionable outtakes from the podcast, join the free level of our AOP Mastermind community. To learn more, go to artofprocurement.com/mastermind. And to find our entire back catalogue of almost 400 episodes, go to artofprocurement.com/podcast.